Okay, this lesson is for the IamKoine.org Apologetic and Outreach Ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, which gathers here faithfully at 2200 Marshall Road, Jacksonville, Arkansas. This is interesting because a lot of feedback is always, it's from the end result. That is, people begin with conclusions that they never produce. That is, they never engage a process to come to that conclusion for themselves. So when we talk about apologetics, have a rationale, it refers chiefly to the fact that do you have an understanding of even the process that brought you to your conclusions, because all of us are primed. We're taught things as children. For example, here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, children are even taught the Hebrew alphabet very early, as early as possible. And the children are quite remarkable in the ability to learn it from the pictures that the letters represent, from the sounds, and then from the numeric value. So why not? Because all language for them is different, and they don't have innate language already primed. That is, they haven't already been taught English, that is, in any formal manner, so that when they're in that class, it's not that difficult for them. We have color sheets and pictures they color. So how do we deal with so many people seem to be so frustrated and so upset when someone doesn't agree with the conclusion, but they don't realize that they themselves are unaware of the conclusion's validity, its strength. Is it fallible, infallible? Is it even in the Bible? Is there even a word for it? So I'll title this one, How to Make a Calvinist, for example. So the late Dr. Robert Morey said, he described people as processians, where we take parts of the Bible and use it as material to process another result, or, for example, another outcome or product. This book, called The Word, by an author named Monroe, went about as an investigative journalist, writing about different religions, and set in on classes and lessons that were being taught. And on page 47, there was a retreat being held where people were studying and discussing the Bible. And there's a quote in here on page 47, "Modern exegesis is like running these stories through a mill, dismantling, pulling apart, and remanufacturing them, and out the other end comes a little ingot of truth." Well, what does that sound like? Sounds like industrial capitalism to me. Of course, any sociologist of knowledge will say, big surprise. But the question is this what we are supposed to be doing with sacred text, or to sacred text? And then, of course, another quote on page 44. Jesus was doing what Moses did. He says the Israelites were called to be in recovery from the addictive, compulsive system of slavery in Egypt. They have no clue how to do that. How would they? They grew up watching Egyptian television. They went to Egyptian schools. That's why they have to spend 40 years learning to live in an other than Egypt manner. It's all about getting out of Dodge. It says we Christians have a fabulous capacity to trivialize the Hebrew Bible. We say the Old Testament is just a bunch of rules and regulations. We don't understand that every single instruction in the Torah is trying to teach people to be non-Egyptians. And lesson number one, the first thing you have to learn is how to operate the economy in a way that's not going to rebuild Egypt. It's the economy, stupid. So that was really funny, and this is a really good book. It says The Word, Imagining the Gospel in Modern America, Anne Monroe, and it was published in 2000, so that's a really good. So let's just look at how to make a Calvinist. So in manufacturing you have, let's say, a machine, and you have manpower, you have materials, and then of course you manufacture. And then the thing we don't want to forget is you have this method. You have a method or a process, as Dr. Morey described it. Okay, so what we'll do is these materials to make a Calvinist, let's find something. let's find something fallible, something that is very unique to, let's say, the Reformed theological paradigm. And let's just say regeneration precedes faith. There. Now that's the axiom of Reformed theology. It is that which is touted by, let's say, a Calvinist. But we don't have a Calvinist yet. We just have this assertion. And if you've ever read after the late R.C. Sproul, very well-known, renowned Reformed theologian, scholastic, prolific author, he recounts in his writings the occasion when he was in a class and a professor wrote this on the board, and he talked about how it went against everything he had understood, and it was antithetical, and it was the inverse of his understanding. So there will be our material. Our manpower will be, let's say, a Calvinist. You have to have one to then make one. So we need a machine and a method and a process. So let's just make us a machine, and here we go. We'll take this like this, and this would be interesting because, you know, these machines, it's like the black box syndrome. You really don't know what goes on in there, but we'll see if we can figure out what goes on in there, because well, it shouldn't be that impossible to understand how this works. So let's say this is a, well, we'll get there in just a minute. Anyway, so let's come over here, and here's our little output. There we go. So in goes our material. So this is our material. I'll just hashtag this M material. There we go. So in goes our material. So input there, material, and in this you have, this is where this is your machine. It could be a seminary, it could be a church already. So let's just write that over here. It's a seminary. Let's say a Reformed seminary or college. It's a college, university, or even what people call a church, and whatever that means. This is not a lesson about ecclesiology. So here's the machine. So now you have your professors, pastors, if they call them that. I don't know what they call it. I have no idea all this, but anyway. So let's just say you have teachers. And so now everything's here. So here's our machine. We've got that. We've got our manpower. We've got our materials, a fallible assertion. There we go. So there's our fallible assertion. And so here we go. And our method is to start with the conclusion first. So you notice it's backwards. It's backwards. Let's say, as I mentioned, the Hebrew alphabet, children and no known engagement of any subject do we begin with conclusions and then work back. If you take a chemistry class, you begin with the periodic table of elements. Elements like in elementary. You learn the elements of that. Paul spoke of rudimentary elements, the stoiche, the stoichiometry, where we get the measure of elements. And the striking thing about it is, for example, in grammar, we learn the alphabet, we then learn vocabulary, we then learn grammar, we then differentiate our parts of speech, the 8 parts of speech, where we now have a noun, and in front of that noun we may have an adjective, or in front of that noun we may have a preposition. Notice a preposition prior to that. Notice after it we may have a conjunction. So we have a conjunction, a noun, an adjective, a preposition, then we have a verb and an adverb, and that interjection, and then we have adjectives. So, well, we have 8 parts of speech. If I left one out, boy, that's sometimes disturbing when I try to say that. So we have those parts of speech. Well, then we have the rules of syntax, how those parts of speech relate. How does an adverb relate to a verb? How is a preposition functioning to give the logical relationship to another word? How is the adjective modifying a noun? Oh, pronoun. I left out pronoun. How is the pronoun? What's the antecedent, where we look for what is the word for which that pronoun is standing. So you see how all that builds, and then you begin to read sentences, and we diagram those sentences to show a diagrammatic expression. Well, that's not how you become a Calvinist. Calvinist, for example, another part of the material is you grab your acronym, your T, U, L, I, and P. Now this is quick. You can grab this very quick. So let's go hashtag acronym, and you drop that in, so that you really can bypass this machine, which a lot of people do. There's a lot of people who say they're Calvinists or tout themselves in that identity, but really have never studied in any kind of seminary, college, university, or have even been involved in a covenant body, a church of any kind. They're just out there and like free ranging, you know. So, and it's easy to pick it up. It's very viral. It's quick. So what you do is this material goes in, and your manpower. So that also not just the professors, but you have to have a student. So here we go. We take this student in here. Here's our pre-Calvinist student. And then when he gets over here, he comes out and he's a Calvinist. And this could take different lengths of time, you know. Let's say someone who just wants to pick it up off the streets, you're looking at maybe less than 10 days. You know, and I'm talking about 10 days where he just reads sometimes during the day while he's drinking coffee at a coffee shop, and he runs into some people and friends, and they can begin the conversation. So this acronym is very, it's a mental model, and it's very useful as far as mental models are concerned. It's just no one really wants to hear about fallibilities. No one wants to return to the text. You won't run into people who want to notice faith. Is this a noun? Is this a finite verb? Or is it a noun, a gerundive noun, a participle? Well, now it's done. The conversation's over. You just won't stop. That's why there's no such thing as this machine ever shutting down. I certainly wouldn't bother trying to go out and be what they call anti-Calvinist, or somehow trying to vilify all this. These people are popping up all the time. There's even a video out there, where are all these Calvinists coming from? Well, you have schools, seminaries, colleges, universities, and churches that it's their infrastructure. Even Baptist fellowships, Baptist churches teach it. Even though not 30 minutes from here, a Southern Baptist Convention church, yes, they still say that. And the teacher is quoting from slides, Spurgeon, and defending the Calvinism, the Calvinistic construct. Well, really, it's going backwards. Now he's trying to install a framework, a scaffolding in a body that's already well developed and well advanced in their life and faith. For example, why would I here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church introduce the scaffolding, the mental model called Calvinism, when for 70 years now they've grown upwardly here, following and living according to the teachings of Jesus, living with the interests of each other, raising their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, using the Bible. We look up words and give their word meanings. We use context, not constructs. So I'll just call these their material, let's say, constructs. There we go. So let's put our constructs in here. There we go. So we don't teach the constructs, and if you notice, there are expositors online, YouTubers, in social media influencers, and they may identify themselves as a Calvinist, but they actually know how to use the text. So the Calvinism to them is quite incidental. It's like a rudimentary thing that they've moved on. Now they will not untether themselves from it. They will cling to it. It's just, again, why would someone come to introduce it to people into a body that's already well developed and grown up in the full measure of the stature of Christ and conformed in His image, as a body of Christ is and is intended to be, and as Paul admonished, to stop being tossed to and fro. So people, swing back and forth between, let's say, a Calvin to an Arminian. Arminian might swing back to a Calvin. Then there's Lutheran, there's Molinist, whatever. But this is the same system. But what's unnecessary is because really the telltale sign is how does this person respond when you actually posit outwardly from the text using a context and word meanings, and you assert that which is taught, communicated, and conveyed in the Bible. Well, when you demonstrate that regeneration does not precede faith, they make the assumption that something has gone wrong, that somehow something's at stake if that doesn't happen. Now, at the same time, they'll say they believe God's all-knowing, that is, He's omniscient, He's omnipresent, and omnipotent, omnipowerful. But they have been convinced that if something is fallible in their construct, that they must keep that construct and preserve it at any cost. It just means, like for someone like me, that when I learned in the Bible that the gospel preceded the finite verb believe, and that the new birth preceded the noun, that is the participle, gerundive noun, believing, and that is that the new birth fell between the finite verb and the participle. Well, sure, God fathers, those He fathers are the ones who are always believing, and the gospel is that through which we're fathered, 1 Corinthians 4:15. All it means, and all I know, is that that's not a necessary feature in the soteriology of the Bible, and it does nothing to change the outcome of what God is accomplishing as the one who is reigning, the King who reigns, the Master who masters, the Lord who lords, and the ruler who rules. So it's really difficult when someone's primed according to something like this, and instead of learning as I did, well, that's just not a necessary assertion. So what does Calvinism look like if you continually go through and remove things that, when you learn the difference between what's asserted, fallibly asserted in Calvinism, and what the scriptures say, then basically the only thing you'll remove is the Calvinism. And you'll notice that there is no forensic before the gospel's preached. And when it comes to even election, for example, since I'm on a roll here, people will start talking about conditional or unconditional election, but you have to back up to that which precedes election, which is calling. That's that word kaleo. Kaleo. And it's a transliteration. We say C-A-L-L, call, and Jesus said He didn't come to call the righteous. The righteous were the ones who did not need the lamb that God provided. They had established their own standing before God. It's called self-righteousness. They had positioned themselves and rejected the righteousness of God, which is Christ Jesus and is accomplished through His faithfulness. So Jesus said, I didn't come to call the righteous, I came to call the sinners. So you're either called or you're not, and unless you're in that class called sinners, which was really what turned the world upside down, these who had established their own righteousness, having rejected the righteousness from God, well, then He chooses those, and then ek, see there's a little prefix here, ek kaleo, which doesn't appear in verb form but appears in the noun form. Those are the guests, the ones who answered the invitation. So you're invited or you're not, which is what this word means, invite. You're invited or you're not, and those who are invited come out, sever our ties. That word ek refers to the severance of that which is to which one was held a previous and strong tie. That's severed. That's through what we know baptism teaches in the Bible, very obviously. And here we are, the ecclesia, so we're the called, the ones who answered the invitation. So we're invited, and those who answered the invitation are considered the out-called, the invited outwardly, and that's who we are. And then we're the ones He chooses, rationalizes outwardly, ek lego, but it has the word lego. You say, well, man, this is an easy lesson to understand. Well, it is if you want to just be scripted. And then the love of God energizes our faithfulness, Paul said to the churches in Galatia. So as the church letter Revelation teaches, we in these churches to whom that letter is written are the called, the chosen, ek lego, rationalized, outward, ek lego, that's a verb. We are the called, the chosen, and the faithful. So really, when you start going down that, it just starts to unravel when you find out that these things are placed together, and you see the acronym, and then you notice that it falls apart. But here's how Calvinists will always be here. I predict they'll always be here, just as most established now for generations. This acronym and its development is just it's several centuries old now. But this is how it works. It's just finding someone who wants to study the text. That's really not a Calvinist issue. You'll find people, I know people who say, well, I'm Catholic, and now they don't even know that the expression of Catholicism that they're expressing or advocating contradicts other expressions of Catholicism. So I'm not sure which expression of Catholicism someone's asserting. And if you begin to talk about the Bible, people become a little anxious and almost incited, more commonly, because they believe you're pushing back against their religion or whatever they were primed according to. And truthfully, you may not be talking about Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Islam, the occult, New Age, or any denomination. You may simply be talking about the Bible, but this priming process makes it very difficult to speak to anyone, because they can get really troubled by it. It's like they get real anxious, like something's wrong, it's not computing. And I'm sorry for that, and I'm sorry that happens to people. It's just that when you aren't scripted, then we really wouldn't be quoting R.C. Sproul. And if we aren't scripted, when we're scripted, when you're primed, people like an R.C. Sproul and other men come out to champion Calvinism and to support this system. Okay, I as a citizen of the United States support pluralism, freedom of conscience, thought, and speech. It's just there are negative effects to the poor souls that's striking in it, that the Bible would be the source of their discomfort and not the Calvinism. So we all seem to believe, as I've taught you in this class and teach this church readily, that we all seem to think that what we were told and how we were primed must have been the truth. But why do we have a Bible class? Why do we teach the languages, for example, in our seminary? Why then do we teach the grammar and the syntax? Why do we then teach hermeneutics, the context, the use of that language, and the proper application, and the implication according to the infallible context of God's Word? I'm not sure, but that will always prevail, this, regardless of whatever measure of success people think they are accomplishing by promoting a fallible soteriological construct or a competing construct with Calvinism. All of them are easily evaluated. You can look at all of them as what machine, which is a process, do they use, who's their teachers, who's their students, what materials, constructs, what are the key elements of it. You can break that down. There's 5 categories of constructs. You can look in that construct and notice categories. You can break it down 5 categories. At each category you can look at the core elements so that you don't really find yourself overwhelmed with the data. And then you can look at how does this manufacture occur. Some are just incidentally pick it up now off YouTube, social media. You can grab the brevity of it and the efficiency of it. And again, but you may not know that some people don't want any more than that. Once they get that, they move on. That's not anything to do with what we do. For example, here at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, we're here carrying out the disciple-making process that was initiated and begun from the time John the Baptist came, announcing the kingdom of God was at hand and calling upon people to mind after the preaching of that inbreaking of the kingdom, that self-disclosed expression of the monarchical reign of God. So here's how you make a Calvinist. It's the same way you can apply this to anything, but I would rather apply it to how do you make a disciple. So we check our process, didactic format of the, for example, in the New Testament, even in the book of Mark, there's 86 questions. There's questions formatted in the original text For example, in John's Gospel, it says Jesus would not entrust himself to man, for he knew what was in man. Well, in the original text, it says Jesus would not entrust himself to men, for what was it that he knew that was in man? And that's for the student to answer the question according to the context before you move on. Well, what was it in man? Well, we noticed his own mother, Mary, had used him, exploited him to compensate for a lack of refreshments at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. I think we say Cana, but she used him for that. He said, "Woman, what business is this of mine?" Well, it wasn't his business, but she was in a pickle, I guess. So, and then he turns around and he goes to the temple, and they've turned his father's house into a den of thieves or a house of merchandise. And so we see his mother exploit him. We see people take his father's house, the temple physically, and appropriate for their own use. So we now can answer the question, what was in men that Jesus knew that found him unwilling to entrust himself to them? Well, the self-serving interest that we all have to be careful of, because in our flesh we want to seek our own interests first. We trample each other underfoot just trying to exit a building if we suspect there might be a fire. The dear man at the pool of Bethesda would have people literally step over him because he was laying there and could not stand up and could not find a way to get himself into the water. So he was just abandoned there by whomever it was that delivered him there, who probably gave up trying to get through the mass response. So when the waters moved, people trampled over him to get into the water for their own healing, never bothering to say, well, let's help him in first. And that's why when Jesus came, he told the man to rise up and take his bed and leave. And that's the difference. It's quite a contrast, Christ and us, the sinless Son of God, the one out from whose faithfulness we are justified, those of us who believe into him. His faithfulness is the gospel. So this is how you make a Calvinist, and it's also how you can make a mess when people try to have a Bible conversation. You'll find out they don't know how. They won't know. They'll pick open or closed theism, never noticing the Bible teaches living God, living theism. But that's just how it is. It's just to help you all out understanding where all this comes from. So you have a good day.